For 30 months, interest rates have been stuck at the lowest level in the Bank of England's 315-year history. Policymakers aren't expected to change that today, but with fears of a double-dip recession, they are considering more drastic action to kickstart the economy.
Well, earlier this week, the Chancellor, George Osborne, admitted that short-term hopes for the economy had been revised down, but he said he intends to stick to his deficit-cutting programme. The Shadow Chancellor, Ed Balls, is with us this morning. Morning. Thanks for coming to see us.
Morning.
So interest rates stuck on 0.5%, which is good news for people who have big loans, mortgages, but there's a lot of people who are relying on their savings, living on savings, who are in fact losing up to 5% a year because of inflation. What should be happening about interest rates in your view?
Well, these interest rates are very, very low here in Britain and in America and in Europe too, and it's a reflection of the terribly dangerous state that the world economy is in. I'm afraid in Europe we're heading for potential catastrophe. In America and Britain as well, things are very difficult. Growth basically stalled, unemployment rising. In those circumstances, there's very little the Bank of England can do to really get the economy moving. But in these circumstances, and it's very hard for savers, a rise in interest rates now would be a complete disaster. It happened in the Eurozone earlier in the year. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. So I'm afraid it's tough for the Bank of England, tough for savers, but these interest rates are going to have to stay low.
Quantitative easing, another round.
Well, quantitative easing sounds incredibly technical. The truth is it's actually very difficult for it to make a big difference. It's how the Bank of England itself can get the economy moving. And I think probably they will signal today they might do some more. Probably at the margin it will help. But frankly, it's very hard for the Bank of England to get the economy moving on its own. The real problem we've got in Europe, in America and in Britain is when consumers and businesses aren't spending, when they're retrenching, if governments try to cut spending drastically as well, that's a very dangerous combination. In those circumstances, if George Osborne is making things tougher for our economy, very hard for the Bank of England to offset that. That's why, in the end, it's fiscal policy, it's government spending and deficit reduction in Europe, America and Britain, which needs to be looked at again. It's got to come down, but if you try and do it too fast, we end up really screwing up the world economy.
Suggesting one or two papers this morning that the lowest rate of tax threshold might be raised to £10,000, which would help the tax burden of a lot of people at the lower end of the pay scale. Is that a good idea?
Well, look, if George Osborne is willing to consider ideas to slow down, to get to a more balanced approach to his deficit reduction, to find ways of getting money into the economy, I'll back him 100%. I have to say...
So is that it's a good idea?
If he's going to do it, personally, if you really want to get spending and purchasing power into the economy quickly, rather than doing it through personal allowances, which tends to be a bit diffuse, better to have a temporary cut in VAT, because a cut in VAT puts money into people's pockets straight away, will have more of an impact upon the economy. But to be honest, if he was to do personal allowances rather than VAT, it would be such a change of direction. So far, he said, and he said it this week, the economy's flatlining. He's changing his growth forecast to be even more pessimistic. At the moment, he's saying, I won't change course. If the Express is saying Downing Street is asking George Osborne to change his mind, well, that would be... Great news, but so far there's been very little sign of it.
You'll be aware that a group of senior economists said yesterday that the higher 50p rate of tax on people earning more than £150,000 a year was damaging the British economy and causing long-term serious damage. You say that they're wrong. What do you know that 20 senior economists don't?
Well, there is a proper debate to be had about how, over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we have a really competitive economy. And there is a debate about making sure that you get taxes right at the bottom and at the top. But the idea that right now, the priority, when you've got unemployment rising, when people are seeing their energy bills going up, when people are really squeezed, you talked about small savers with low interest rates. Do you really think the right priority now is to only cut taxes for people whose incomes are over £150,000 a year? That is a tiny minority of people. I actually think it would be much better to do something which helps everybody at the moment. That's why a VAT cut would make much more sense right now. I don't think an interest rate rises will help, but we've got to get other ways to help people on middle and low incomes. Top rate of tax, it's not the priority at the moment.
John Leach has got in touch with us this morning to ask you, what interest rate would the government and we all be having to pay if your policies, or the Labour's policies when the government had been followed, and what the knock-on effect that interest rate would have had on the economy? In other words, they would have been presumably much higher.
Well, look, it's hard, this one, because obviously the global situation the last year has got worse. But a year ago, or 18 months ago, we had low inflation, but the economy was strengthening and unemployment was falling. People were debating then whether the Bank of England would need to move interest rates up. What's happened since? The economy has flatlined, unemployment rising again. Our interest rates aren't low in Britain because we're doing well. Our interest rates are low in Britain because nobody thinks our economy is going to grow. And the markets are saying, look, without growth, you can't be credible. It's a problem for us, these very low interest rates. It's a problem for savers, but it's a bad signal from the global financial markets about what is actually happening to growth and our economy in Britain.
Just before you go, have you had a chance to read Alistair Darling's book?
I haven't had a chance to read Alistair Darling's book. Obviously, I look forward to it. There's been lots of books in the last year, and I'm saving them up for a holiday at some future year. I just thought you'd have had a look, because you're mentioned, and it sounds like things were pretty poisonous, weren't they, between number 10 and number 11 at the time, and you were part of that whole setup. Was that a really good way to run government, do you think? Well, I was Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families, came on here, talked to you many times about child protection, schools, all those kind of issues. The fact is, there were some difficult arguments between Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling. Anybody who's known Gordon Brown as long as Alistair Darling knows Gordon Brown had his odd moment of volcanic temper. We all know that. But the fact is, I think that, and I mean this genuinely, I think Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown can be proud of what they did together to get the world through that crisis in 2008. And, I hope Alistair Darling can reflect upon that and think that, he did some good things.
It's on your reading list, then?
It's on my long-term
on your Christmas reading list.
I'm not sure about that. I think I might try and enjoy Christmas.
All right, Head Balls, thanks very much.
Doesn't sound like it's going to get read at all by that particular individual.